Disclaimer. I am a law student, and the legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, hey, hello there. Can you
Hey!
hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I just woke up and I'm very groggy, I guess is the right word. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean I get it. It's very weird. So like what time frame, what time zone are you in? Because I assumed you were in the Americas, but just like if you're just waking up, I assume that's not correct.
No, I'm in Central European time.
Oh,
I live in Denmark.
oh, no way! I actually have some friends who
Yeah.
live over in Denmark. They live over in Copenhagen. When I was over studying abroad, I did a study abroad program a couple of years ago. When I went to study in London, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, it was like a public
Mm,
policy healthcare study abroad program I did for the summer. And there was a weekend where they were like, "Hey, if you want to go like explore Europe, then we're not going to tell you what to do or where to be." So I just called up my friends who are over in Denmark, and I was like, "Hey, will you let me crash at your place for a little bit?" And they're like, "Absolutely, come over here." It's really cool. We explored Copenhagen for a bit. We explored the local. There's like a Viking museum. That was really
yeah.
cool. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But no, that's an awesome, awesome country. So yeah, no, I totally get it. Yeah, like anytime I try to communicate with them, it's always like the wackiest schedules, right? So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'm just trying I'm trying out a few different streaming times just to
Hmm.
see what fits me the best because I'm sort of like exploring the options before I have like a complete set schedule.
Yeah. No,
Right now, I try waking up in the early morning and then doing a stream before work. We'll see. It's a bit rough on me, honestly.
I totally get that. Now you say I've actually noticed that. So I think that you say somewhere in your bio that you work at a co-op. So like, where do you work exactly? Because that's super interesting.
Yeah, well, I work in a co-op that I was the founder of about 3 years ago.
Oh,
Here
what?
in
That's crazy.
yeah, we made it about 3 years ago, and we're still running. It's pretty good. We make games and like game-like experiences. So our last project that we've actually just finished, we were working on a virtual reality simulation for the healthcare sector here in Denmark to better
Really?
diagnose. Fuck, what's it called? Uh, it's like a lung disease, like what you
Oh,
get from
are
fuck.
you just gonna? Are you about to
Here,
say COVID?
no, it's not COVID.
Yeah, yeah.
It's something that you usually get from like smoking a lot.
Oh, I mean, it's not like asthma,
Uh,
is it? Or it's I know there's a good amount of diseases that can come from chronic smoking. Uh, okay. So what does it do? Like it helps.
chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Does that make sense? Is that something?
Chronic obstructive. So, I mean, just based on what you're saying, it sounds like something just that once you're smoking for long enough that it begins to like interfere with your ability to breathe properly, right? At its most
Yeah,
basic.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, but that's really cool. So, like, how do you? So, like, you make video games to like virtual reality simulators. What? So you can like go inside the body, or like you're able to simulate like performing surgeries, or like.
No. It's to help diagnosis. So basically, the way that it works is that well, you go into virtual reality and you sort of get a patient
Mhm.
that is usually in their own home because that's where like most errors happen. It's when they go out and do house calls, and then you get them being in their own home, and you get sort of like a random citizen or patient based on a few like parameters,
Mhm.
and then you have to sort of figure out, well, how do I diagnose this person properly? And then there's like a set of things that you have to go through, and you can like measure their pulse, listen to their breathing, stuff like that. And it's like yeah, you have like I guess, a person in front of you, and then you have to sort of do the normal things
Mhm.
that you would usually do, and then you within there also go through like a list of things that are like usually like prescribed that you should do.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. 1 second, I'm gonna change out the battery for my headset is a little low. It'll take literally a second. If I say literally a second, it'll take literally like 3 seconds. People are gonna yell at me and be like, Riley, it was like 5 seconds. Alright, there we go. Yeah, I mean, like, that's super interesting. Yeah, because, I mean, I've been learning a lot more about, like, worker co-ops as I've been, you know, getting more involved in, like, online political spaces. Like, for me, I mean, you know, what I am doing in life is, you know, like, I'm doing a lot of different kinds of work, but it's very isolated from a lot of national discussions, especially on different forms of workplaces, right? Like, I've literally had meeting after meeting over the course of this month with, like, different law firms, right? And it's essentially like, and I hope that if people watch this after the fact, and I don't want any future employer to take this the wrong way, but I mean this from, you know, in just a completely transparent and kind-hearted way, a lot of them are providing essentially the same sort of service, right? Like, it's not too much innovation that's happening, right? Whereas with worker co-ops, it seems like there's a lot of really cool innovation happening. So it's really cool to hear about, like, the different business models and how people are able to sort of implement that. So yeah.
Yeah. Just 1 second. Thank you so much for the raids to Dosia. I hope you had a nice stream. I'm just talking to Riley. Mm-hmm. And we will soon enough be talking about, I guess, police reforms. Those of the plan, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So if we want to launch into that, so yeah, thank you for having me on. So is there? Oh, and if you want, you can turn on your video. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see me.
Streamlabs shit!
Is weird. If you want to, you can. But
yeah, let's try. There you go. Okay, now you can see me.
All right, cool. Streamlabs is weird, so I'm not sure if you'll be able to see me. But if you were to look at my stream, I basically have my video where it is on Discord.
Oh, fuck. Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
Wait, what's your stream?
Yeah, like, it's on my... Well, I mean, like, right now, if you look at my stream, it's like, we have... Like, basically where my face is blank there, I just moved, like, my screen capture, so it's, like, in that place. So at least for me, it's working. I'm not sure how to change it so it, because I mean, like, if, well, hold on, turn on camera. Will this work? It won't work because I have my camera going to 2 different places at once right now. Which is the issue. Like, right now I'm trying to turn it on, it won't work. Or if you want, we could just, like, turn off camera. It's either is fine by me.
No, we can do camera. I'm just, wait, fuck. I'm just trying to figure out how this works.
Yeah. Technology is weird.
Fucking hell. Please? Yeah. Wait, are you streaming on Twitch as well, or only on YouTube?
No, on YouTube. Yeah. I'm probably going to look into dual streaming in the future. Because I know that that's something that's available, because I use Streamlabs OBS, and that's a feature that they offer. I just haven't had the time to look into it, because I'm working, like, God, like, 2 other jobs right now. I mean, like... Yeah, it's weird because, I mean, like, I didn't go into this thinking of it as a job, but it's very quickly turning into one, which is just a joy, right? I shouldn't say that. I thoroughly enjoy what I do.
No, it's cool, but it's very. I think it's very. I guess it's physically taxing when you do the stream, mm-hmm. but it's also, I think, mentally taxing, at least for me.
Oh no, yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree, right? Like, being able to put on, because I do want to be able to put on, you know, a decent, not performance, but I want to be able to put out the best work product that I can, right? Because when I'm talking to people, and I do like talking to people, I want to make sure I leave a good impression and that, you know, I fairly and accurately represent my views, and I'm actually able to have a constructive conversation. It's kind of why I'm looking forward to this, because for... you know, as cool as it was to have everyone on the stream last week, I do not feel it was as productive as I wanted it to be. A lot of people aired out their own, you know, individualized grievances, and I think that was cool, but, you know, as we sort of talked about a little bit on Twitter, I was much more interested in having a more policy-intensive discussion than what it seemed a lot of people really wanted to.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of times, especially when you do a panel show. I mean, I like for all intensive purposes, I think panels aren't generally for like deep discussions unless you
Mhm.
have like one specific topic and you try to heavily moderate it.
Yeah.
Um, I think I think it was okay. Like it was
Hmm.
as far as like panels usually go, it was pretty okay.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know. Like the way that I usually treat panels is that I treat them more like entertainment, and then I use them primarily to meet new people that I can then have like other talks with, like more like one-on-one talks like this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
That makes a lot
and
of
I think that
sense.
yeah, I think that's like one of the best ways to sort of view these panel shows because I mean, especially if you're like more like usually these panel shows will have like 8 to 10 people, and then I mean you get like maybe like 10-20 minutes total of speaking time per person if you're lucky. It's I don't
Hmm.
know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I
It's
definitely get that. You just recently had it was either it's either yesterday or tomorrow. You had on Rico, right? Or um
oh yeah, I was supposed to, but yeah, we messed it up with the time.
oh shit. Oh, I'm so
Yeah,
sorry. I
so
just saw that that was on the same announcement that you put out for me.
yeah. We were planning to, but I messed it up with like the announcements and the times, and yeah, it was whatever. Yeah, we'll do it next week for sure.
All right.
We plan it next week.
Yeah, that's
So yeah.
cool. So are you ready to sort of start the conversation, or do you still need to set something up?
Sure.
Okay, cool.
No, we're good.
All right.
Um,
So
so yeah,
yeah, you go
do you
ahead.
want to go?
No, no, you go ahead. Just because I mean, I have a bunch of different things I could talk about, but it'd probably be better if you sort of like set off where we're starting from.
Sure. You're where were you from
Uh,
in the U.S. or
yeah,
do you
yeah.
not say?
Well, I mean, I can say generally, right? I've been around. I'm originally from Ohio. Then I lived in Tennessee for 5 years. Then I lived in Arkansas, and then in Florida, then back in Ohio, and now I'm out in Maryland. So I've been sort of around.
Have you seen? I'm actually like um because you say you're in Maryland. I've just started watching The Wire. Have you seen that ever?
So I have not, but everyone and their mother has told me to. Yeah, so I'm sure that I will. Right now, I have to work through, and I'm ashamed to say this. I have to work through Tiger King because I have a friend who just guided
Oh,
me to
there.
start
Yeah,
watch that, and I hate it. It's drama, and I normally hate drama shows, but it's one of those things where it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. I just have to
for
finish it
sure.
through.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
The Tiger King is actually it's actually I don't know. It's actually so good, but it's hard to identify why it's good. It's like one of those TV shows. It's really interesting.
it's
I
definitely
definitely
yeah.
s-
Go
yeah, I
ahead.
definitely see why so many people have taken a liking to it. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, like, I was originally fighting watching it for the longest time, but then I have a friend who was like, "Oh my god, Riley, you have to watch Tiger King," and I was like, "Fine." And I watched the first episode, and I was like, "Oh my god, I cannot stop!" Right? Like, it's just kind of like that visceral sort of like primal. I don't know. It tickles my humor in the same way that like The Office does, where it's just like you just it's just a gaggle of terrible people, and it's just a game of one upping each other on how terrible you can be, right? Like
For
whole
sure.
that's essentially the whole appeal of it. So yeah, I don't know. I'll finish that and then I'll watch The Wire. But yeah.
Yeah, I get that.
Hmm. Um,
Yeah, it was just interesting because I think actually I think The Wire at like I guess ahead of its time sort of portrays a lot of the police brutality that goes on in
hmm,
sort of like I would even say they try and display it in like a neutral light, or maybe that's just me like watching after the fact. But it seems like they're not like they're not like super approving of like the bad stuff that cops do
hmm.
to like interrogate people and sort of catch people out in the streets and all those stuff and like the big war on drugs. I think it's a pretty good show for me. It seems at least of like portraying sort of some of the um, more problematic aspects of like policing. And I
Hmm.
think I think a lot of cop shows or like shows about like police enforcement in general don't do a very good job of that. They're like very much pro police. Um,
Sure. No, and I definitely get that impression, right? I mean, I grew up, I came from a family of, lawyers, especially on my mom's side, right? Like they watch a lot of, you know, like NCIS, Law and Order SVU, God, Bones is one, like all these like very cop oriented, law oriented. And mind you, probably some of that informed the reason why I went into the legal profession, right? At least some part of that, aside from, you know, the fact that my grandmother and my mother before me were both attorneys. But yeah, no, I mean, I definitely get that. So it is sort of a diamond in the rough to be able to find something that's different, which actually looks at cops in sort of a grittier or, you know, just an outright negative light.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess this is a good segue to talk about police reform, I guess.
Yeah.
So one thing that I wanted to get in on while on your show is that I wanted to sort of discuss different policies, but more so I wanted to discuss the importance of like different policies, like a shopping list of like what's most important, because I think there's like a lot of changes you can make. And a lot of those are either on a policy level or on a, I guess, on a funding level or on a, I guess even on like a community level or no, not community, like societal level, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's this list. I linked it to you. It says it's the joincampaign0.org.
Yeah, I've taken a look at that.
Yeah, I think that's generally like a good place to start. And I think they have a sort of a comprehensive list of what I would consider to be like reasonable policies that I think also have like a way to get implemented. And they also have like examples of places where some of these things have already been implemented. So yeah, maybe do you want to go through that?
Yeah, I mean, like, definitely. So there's two ways I'll approach these, and we can definitely talk about each of these individually. So in preparation for this, I actually was very fortunate. I was able to schedule to have a meeting with the head of civil rights over at the AG's office and basically talk to her about mind you, I have to keep some of this confidential, right? Because, you know, some of the conversation that we had is, it goes to like attorney work product. It goes to things that I and she are working on. But just from a general perspective, right? And things which I asked her that I could share and she gave me permission to share. When we are considering policy to implement, and there are some of these that will definitely fall into the categories I'm going to be describing, right? But she and other organizations like the AG's office, like very prominent civil rights organizations, want to make sure when they are evaluating which policies to try and push through legislation, because that's the primary way that you're going to get these policies passed, right? Like they have to go through legislation, whether it's at the state or federal level, right? You want to be able to consider what kind of policies are ripe based on societal context, and what kind of policies are viable based on who is in Congress, right?
For sure, yeah.
So, for example, in Maryland, there was, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to show you this email, but this was, because this is in my work email, but my boss forwarded me an email from the ACLU of Maryland about how it's basically a list. It's a very short list. It's a very brief list of about 6 or so some reforms that the ACLU of Maryland, but also like a giant laundry list of organizations would like to see pushed through Maryland based on the specific context of Maryland law, where it's at, what issues have been debated for a while, and what they think can get pushed through, right? And again, I can't say too much because it's attorney work product. But these are the types of things which are more likely to be pushed through and which are going to have a lot more focus on them, right? So for example, like one of the options, I can just like give you the bullet list of these, right? Repeal the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. Essentially, like that is something which exists in Maryland and other states, which, among other things, gives officers the ability to have like a week of buffering time to talk amongst themselves to get their story straight, more or less, before they have to tell other officers or other investigatory authorities what had happened, right? That's happened in a couple different instances. Another thing that they want is for the control of the Baltimore City Police Department to be assured to Baltimore City residents, because even though Baltimore, like, it's weird, but in Baltimore, the police department is actually beholden to a council over in Annapolis. So in order to take up grievances with the Baltimore Police Department, people will have to travel like several hours down to Annapolis, the state capital, and that's something that's not available to a lot of people. Investigations into police misconduct must be transparent. Oftentimes they are not, and people aren't aware of where investigations are into certain instances of police misconduct. And this is a really important one, and this is one which probably is going to be on your list from what I remember. If it's not, it should be. Maryland must limit the use of force by Maryland must limit the use of force by law enforcement. So something that's very particular. I'm not sure how things are over in Denmark, but this is just like a little bit of legal background for purely educational purposes. I'm not a lawyer. Disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. But this is how it works in America, right? A lot of what you have, like for the most part, like the vast majority of states in the US, we have what's called use of force statutes. And what those do is they regulate specifically how much force an officer or officers are able to use when they are executing an arrest, and under what kind of circumstances police are able to execute arrests, right? Unfortunately, Maryland does not have one at all, which means that we default to common law authority. Common law authority meaning that our law, or the governing law in this area, is just what the Supreme Court has said in previous cases. The primary case on this subject at this point is a case called Graham v. Connor. It's from about, I'm trying to remember, I think it's like 50 or some odd years ago. But essentially what it says is that an officer is able to use whatever force is reasonable given the circumstances in order to effectuate an arrest. That is not great, because what that means is that as long as, like practically speaking, like the practical effect of that is that as long as an officer is able to prove in a court of law that whatever they did is quote unquote reasonable given the circumstances, then they can do pretty much whatever they want, right? And if you want to take that to the logical extreme, like here's a hypothetical. If you have someone who, let's say, doesn't necessarily believe that a person of color poses a threat, but the person of color that they are isolating is alone, and you have a couple other police officers with you, and you decide that you just want to take out your grievances against this person. Well, then if you were to like put the person down on the ground and crush him with his neck, and like crush the back of his neck with your knee, and eventually kill him. That sounds very
unreasonable. I don't think that would ever happen.
But I know, right? Completely unreasonable. But if you were able to get in front of a judge and you were able to convince that judge based on the totality of the circumstance, you just have 4 officers get up on the stand and be like, "Officer, listen, he was being completely unreasonable. He was being unruly. We thought he was going to kill someone." Like that's what we thought. And of course, there's no one who's able to like say anything contrary because that was the only person, available at the time. Then the judge will probably let them get away with it, right? Again, completely educational, not a lawyer. This is just based on, the research I've done, and disclaimer, all that. But that's the issue, right? Is like reasonability, like as a standard, is really not great because it gives officers a lot of leeway to be able to do like whatever they want as long as they're able to convince a judge that whatever it was that they did was reasonable. And mind you, this assumes that the judge isn't already also biased against people of color, right? Like that's a whole nother set of issues, right? Like if you have someone who's like more overtly biased against like people who come from those sorts of situations or those sort of backgrounds, then like officers might not even have to try. They could just be like, "Listen, officer," or "Listen, judge, is a fucking black person." And then the judge is like, "Oh shit, yeah, all right, yeah, completely reasonable. You're all free to go," right? And that's the real danger. Now we don't see that as much overtly nowadays, but like it's certainly pretty established that like there is a very negative bias against people of color in the courts, right? Especially over the course of history.
Yeah, and like a multitude of ways even now. Mm-hmm. Like there's a discrepancy
or
disparate. Yeah, there's like a difference in the sentencing that like black people face, like is disproportionate, like based on even like when you account for like all of the externalities as well, and not even just in like the sentencing and like how severe the sentences are, but also from like even the juries are oftentimes like more likely to give like black people harsher sentences, or
Mhm.
like they're less symptomatic, or, fuck, sympathetic,
Yeah. There you go.
to yeah. I'm having a hard time speaking.
Hey, you're fine. It happens to all of us. I
uh,
completely get it. Um,
um,
but yeah, I mean, there is a lot of precedent about that, and that's actually, and it. This all just goes to the idea that like when you have something like a reasonability standard, especially like something which is just like not regulated by statute at all, that's a serious problem. And the reason why this is on this list that's sent out by the ACLU is because it is really weird that Maryland is in the minority, right? Like most states do have use of force statutes, which say what police officers can and cannot do when effecting an arrest. Um, and so like that's what makes it, and the fact that we've also like as you know in the state of Maryland have tried to get use of force statutes passed at many times prior, but we've been unable to for reasons I'm still looking into, right? But we just haven't been able to get it pushed through. So now the state has sort of realized like, or at least like all these organizations that are trying to get this pushed through are like, okay, now the issue is ripe. Like Black Lives Matter has clearly had an effect on like what is able to be done as far as policy in the world. We have a lot of people in the state Congress who are able to and willing to support this. We have all of the support from everyone. So not only is this ripe, but we know that we're able to get it through with who is in Congress, right? That's sort of, I guess, and like I said, there's a lot of things like in there to unpack, but like that's the totality of the circumstances that I look for when I'm looking at policies to push through. Another great example, and this is the last one on the list, is like removing law enforcement from like children's schools, which is something that not a lot of people have been talking about in this instance, but which is still an issue, right? Where you have people with firearms who are in like educational institutions who very well could take the life of someone else if they were in such a situation where they could, or where they wanted to, or were able to, right? So that's another one which has been not talked about as much nationally, but which has been a problem in Maryland for a very long time. And based on like the specific cultural circumstances in Maryland is something which is a lot more likely to be passed than say, if we were to look at the examples from Campaign Zero, like demilitarization, right? Like that, as for as good as it is, probably does not have as high a chance of passing. Although it is definitely something that I agree with in principle.
sure. Do you want to go through your list just real quick, like point by point?
Yeah, or do we, or
Um,
my list? So do we want to talk about like Campaign Zero or?
no. I guess I think you have like a list of four things. That's what I wrote down at least.
Oh yeah,
Is it
yeah.
four things or?
It was a couple. I think I went through most of them. I'll go through them again, right? So what the
Sure.
ACLU of Maryland recommended was to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which goes to like the week-long buffer, like among other things, a week-long buffer for police officers to be able to sort of get their story straight and be able to collaborate with each other. To shift control of the Baltimore City Police Department to Baltimore residents and away from Annapolis, to make it so that investigations into police misconduct, so that they are transparent and so that the public can follow them, to limit the use of force or to institute a formal use of force statute in Maryland, with appropriate restrictions on what they are able to do, and also so I guess it's five. And then lastly, to remove law enforcement from our children's schools, or to be able to remove at least the ability to use deadly force from law enforcement in children's schools. Those are the ones that they recommend.
Sure. I think those are not ones that I haven't heard before, and I think like all of those are interesting in sort of their own ways. I think sort of the week of buffer time that the police get sort of to I guess to go over or like coordinate their stories. I heard in other places in the U.S. I think it's like oftentimes it's like 48 hours where they can't be. I guess they can't be questioned when there's a complaint about them or like when something goes down. They have like 48 hours. That's like an interesting concept. Like I have a hard time imagining why that was implemented in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, like if we want to get, I mean, I don't know. This is being extremely cynical, but these are also like it's a Bill of Rights promulgated by the people who effectuate arrests to begin with, right? Like they
Yeah.
are like it's effectively asking the people who arrest people to self-regulate themselves to an extent. So it's not as surprising to me. A lot of this probably also has to do with the strength of, and this is something else that probably is worth talking about. I'm not sure if something can be done about it at this point, but I mean, police unions have a lot of bargaining strength in most state politics, right? For example, and again, like this is like I'm in a when I say caveat, I am here in my private capacity. I'm not here as a representative of the AG's office. Like this is just me talking from my own experience. But even when I do work for, like, I find myself in a weird situation working for the AG's office just from an educational perspective, because while the AG's office does have an oversight function of, of different police departments and police unions in the state, right? Like they are primarily the ones who prosecute instances of police brutality. They also want to try and maintain a good relationship with police unions and police departments because they do work with them. Like right now, I am working on a conspiracy case, right? And I have to work with police, and I have to work with police officers or the evidence that they provide without getting to attorney-client privilege, I cannot talk a lot about it, but, I can say that much, right? And so it's a weird position for us to be in, and it is political, right? We want to be able to maintain a good enough relationship with them so that when I should rephrase, so that when the AG's office recommends policy, that they actually follow them, because as the AG's office, like they have a lot of discretionary power. They have a lot of ability to persuade, like it effectively the power they have in and of themselves is to be able to, like the president, be able to have some authority with their recommendations. It's like, this is a recommendation from like the highest legal authority in the state of Maryland, right? But they can't institute any formal policy or law, right? And so if they want to be able to do things just purely on their own, they have to maintain a good relationship with police unions. And that puts a lot of power in the position of police departments and police unions, because now they can be like, well, we're going to bargain with you to make sure, if you really want these things to happen, or if you want us to follow what you're asking us to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's and that's why, again, I always say, if you really want policy to be passed and you want meaningful change to happen, go out and vote. All right, go out, vote in your electives, or whatever. I don't know what your legal system is like in Denmark, but at least in the U.S., like the most important thing is electing in people who will actually advance those policies. Because then, like, even just from the AG's office, they're able to like collaborate with those people and be like, all right, you're all about these issues, push this through. We will literally write the bill for you, and just you have to sign your name on dotted line.
Yeah. I think that's super important, especially in like local elections. I think I believe like most police departments, if not all, are controlled in or are, I guess, changed through local elections, right? One way or another, like right. Through electing like a mayor or something like that. Mm-hmm. And like most people just don't vote in those, and I don't know. It's really interesting. Like you wouldn't really expect like mayors and like these local representatives to have like reforming the police force on like very high on their list of things to do, right? Because like most of the people who vote for them are like old people, like old white people who like never interact with the police, and you're just like, well, I mean, if our voters don't give a fuck, like why would they do that? I mean, it's I don't know.
No, I mean, like, it is a very tough situation to be in, because when we're talking about electing in officials, especially on issues of police reform, it is really, really easy to run against, like, a very hard police reform candidate, because, like, the immediate stand-in, like, it's cookie cutter, but it works pretty much every single time for a conservative candidate, is to run on the platform of law and order, right? Oh, they want to come in and roll back the police, or they want to do X, Y, and Z to like de-escalate or, to take away their power. There's going to be criminals running amok in the streets. It's going to be pure anarchy, right? And obviously like a lot of this is not true. And, these people would never evaluate these policies to begin with, but that's the platform that they run on, because, a lot of people who vote for those sorts of candidates, they don't vote based on like, critically evaluating the policies of the alternative candidate. They vote based on a perspective of right now, especially like people who are voting populations. So the populations that you talked about, like white, upper middle class people, people with relatively comfy lives, right? Like they vote from the perspective of my life is comfy right now. I do not want that to change. Any change can introduce some degree of harm to my current status in life, right?
Yeah,
so all
sure.
you have to do to oppose like a progressive or like a police reform candidate is to basically say, I am not going to change anything. And you're gonna get a ton of votes for that. You're gonna get a ton of votes. You're gonna get a ton of support. And it ultimately comes down to, especially like the districts that you are voting in, or wherever it is you're locally voting in, like how much support you're able to gather from the demographics that you want, right? So like if you're voting for a more progressive candidate, like how many votes can you get from like communities of color, like, various minority communities, or like young people, right? Like those are the people who recognize or are much quicker to recognize systemic issues, because it's not like they have lived long enough to be able to benefit from the oppression of other people. Like for me, and unfortunately, like, I don't know, we can extrapolate I won't extrapolate too much, right? But I mean, like, as a lot of people, get older, you find people who end up getting into positions in life where usually they have either failed or succeeded at living in the system, and they either drastically want things to change, or they really want to like maintain the status quo because they've been able to make it, right? And so it's kind of, that's generally speaking, or at least in my opinion, why you do see trends like, there are a lot of trends that as people get older, they get more conservative, right? Like that, there's plenty of polling data to support that. And so it really does just become a game of like getting the young people out there to vote and getting a lot of minority groups out there to vote. And unfortunately, that's very hard because a lot of them either have never gotten involved in the political process to begin with, or have just always been sort of disenfranchised by it.
Like a lot of young people, they aren't even registered to vote. They've never registered to vote. Like there's so many barriers in the US to like vote. It's insane. I don't know. There's like so many voting reforms you could do in the US which would help all of these things.
Oh yeah. No, I totally get it. Like the biggest one, it's really cool. So I recently had on, actually I can't say too much about their work, but I'm very close friends with an attorney who just did a bunch of civil rights work for prisoners' rights in Florida, right? Specifically prisoner voting rights. And that's a big issue in our country, right? Because there's a lot of people, like if we really want to talk about, like especially relating to like Black Lives Matter, a lot of people in color in prisons, because prisons disproportionately have vastly more people of color in them. You have a lot of people who are fundamentally unable to vote, because usually states have some law stating to some effect that if you have been incarcerated even just once in your life, then it is either impossible or near impossible to be able to vote again afterwards, right? And that's really kind of terrible, because at some level, and this is a very hard policy to be able to talk about in advance, because like when you're talking about prisoners, they are like, to the average person in society, not the most sympathetic demographic, right? But the fact of the matter is, like, these are people who probably need to be able to vote the most, because they are the people who disproportionately face some of the hardest living conditions in society, right? When I lived in Memphis and I worked at, and I was a program director at a homeless outreach organization, I would do intakes for, most of the people who came to us, and you see a lot of trends, right? And one of the biggest trends is just about everyone that came to us had previously been in prison at least one point in their life. And vastly, like the overwhelming majority of the people who came to us were people of color. And so it became a very hard thing to deal with, because we have such a prison system where it really does not do anything to improve people when they're actually in prison. And so usually the prison system will spit them out in a substantially worse position than they had been in going in. They don't have any practicable job skills. Now they have a record that they have to turn over to employers, and usually they end up turning to crime again. Or if they had drug issues, they end up turning to drugs, which makes them turn to crime. Then they end up back in the jail system, and the cycle repeats. And none of these people are able to vote. And it's terrible, because like these are the people who probably like need to vote the most. So yeah, when we're talking about like these issues of police reform, it sucks, because especially like with Black Lives Matter, these are peoples whose voices are effectively silenced.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the United States has one of the highest like recidivism
Hmm.
rates from like people I don't know. It's there's like so many issues there in terms of like I don't know. Like I don't even know where to start. It must be extremely frustrating to work in like law or like be interested in law enforcement or legal stuff in the United States and just looking at like all of the things that need to be fixed. Like how
Yeah.
where do you even start? Like what's your like starting point?
A great starting point is to watch, if you haven't, and for people who are watching, and if you haven't, I don't. It's a very big documentary on Netflix. It's called 13th, or 13. I
Hmm.
can't remember. It's about the 13th Amendment, right? And really, a lot of the conversation sort of begins there, and you can trace a lot of the historical precedent for a lot of where we are at in society, probably back to that amendment. That was the amendment which, quote unquote, abolished slavery. But the problem was that it abolished slavery in all instances except for people who are prisoners, right? Or something to
Yeah.
that effect, right? Except for people who are in prisons or, yeah. Which kind of sucks because that, like, I don't know how people couldn't have possibly seen that creating a perverse incentive to just make as many people, to put as many people in prisons as possible, because I mean, like, you could trace that to the development of the prison industrial complex. You have like tons and tons of privately owned prisons. Like, just the concept of a privately owned prison is just astounding to me. um, which are able to make their people work for near to nothing, right? Like, literally,
Yeah.
like pennies for the hour, or yeah, like pennies for an hours of work, right? And it's terrible because you end up with situations, and then they just treat people terribly. You have up, one example, is that you have women, who they don't provide, um, reproductive, various, things like tampons, pads, and so
Yeah.
on. Like, they don't provide those things to women who need them, or to anyone who needs them. And so what will end up happening is that the women or the other people who are working in those positions who need those services will end up saving literally all the money that they make just to be able to afford those products, which is kind of terrible, right? That literally even the small amount of money that they do give you ends up being wasted on things which are already basic necessities. Um, so I mean, and I don't say this. This isn't something which is, like, there's no solution to that other than just like abolish private prisons and reform the 13th Amendment. And there's so many issues.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
It is pretty wild. Really, what it's going to
I don't know.
take. Yeah, it's. I mean, it is sad, right? Because this is such a substantive issue in national politics, and I mean, like, it is good to be able to, win the battles that we can wherever we're able to, right? The policies that we've discussed are things which are, like, they can be won in Maryland, right? Like, there is enough support, and the circumstances are ripe to be able to push them, which is good, right? Like, it will resolve, like, it will have a materially beneficial effect on the lives of people. But like the root issues, like the constitutional amendment, with the way that the federal government, and especially like, with the way that Congress is right now, that will take something much more substantive than what's available right now to be able to resolve. And that's why I see a lot of what is being done, like on YouTube and on social media, to be very important, because like fundamentally that starts by changing people's minds and making them believe that this is important and starting a movement or growing already existing movements. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
for
I'm
sure.
I'm soapboxing here a little bit. Please jump in, whenever you want
No, no,
to.
no. It's all good. Yeah, I think you're completely right in your assessment. I think especially when we look at and especially when you look at like the demographics of like YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and like all these things, it's like mainly young people.
Mhm.
And it's young people who are the ones that need to hear the message most, I think. And they need to hear it at an early age. Um, I
Yeah.
think I think you should probably like know about politics. I mean, as probably in like high school or something in the United States.
Well,
Like
that's
most.
yeah. Well, that's the trouble, right? Because I mean, to some extent, we sort of do know about politics, but we know about politics from a very pro-America perspective, right?
Hmm.
Which, I mean, like, I don't know. There's a whole conversation to be had about like how to teach political content in public schools and private schools. I don't know how private institutions do it. I imagine it's going to vary based on who is teaching and who is in the position. But like with public schools, you're taught, especially like United States history from a very Americanized perspective, right? Like we all learned about Christopher Columbus being the first person to discover the Americas, and he just kind of came in. He was this cool dude, and he saw the Indians, and he was like, "Hey, we're gonna just all be good friends, and everything will
Yep.
be great, and there's no harm here, and we're not gonna definitely backstab you, and they're not gonna go down to like the South Americas and just pillage and rape and all that. No, it's amazing that we go through that entire education system and we don't learn about any of that, or what we do learn is very minimal. So there is like politics in there, like it's kind of baked into the basics of it. So when we talk about like teaching politics in public schools, I agree, but it's going to be very different depending on who is writing the curriculum. So we want to be careful about that. Right? Like ultimately,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, go on.
No, yeah, for sure. I think talking about like what needs to be taught, and even on a more fundamental level, like who gets to write the curriculum will always be sort of inherently biased, I guess, like to one side or another. It's like a problem that doesn't really have a good solution, I think, because I think it's impossible to teach politics from an unbiased way. I think unless you're teaching history, like or like what happened, right? And even history is biased to some extent depending on like who you ask, right?
Oh yeah.
So it's yeah, I don't know how to do that.
Well, I mean, there's a whole field of study. I think that's the study of epistemology. So one of my friends in my Discord, another law student, is actually dating a girl who studied that, right? Was a history major and actually studied like how history is recounted and how it's written. And yeah, there's a whole field of study. Like people devote their entire like major fields of study to like looking at this question of like how we should recount history. And it is a very important question, right? Because ultimately, like there's the old adage, history is written by the victors, right? And any way that we teach history is going to be in some way biased by the people's perspective who are telling it, right? Now, there are ways to mitigate that, right? Like there are professional practices and like best practices to making sure that we mitigate the effect of bias and, increase the truthfulness, the validity of the recounting, right? But it is hard, especially when we're teaching politics. Like even when I was an undergrad, I have a degree in political science with honors, right? Like I got like one of the top-notch, political science educations that I could really ask for, and I'm very happy with it. But it was also very interesting to me because like you could feel the tension in the department where there are some professors who clearly had biases one way or the other. In fact, it was very hard to find someone who was very apolitical, right? Now, they had certain practices to try and mitigate that bias, right, as much as possible in the classroom setting. But it's always like that overhanging thing, especially when you have a student that comes from a different ideological perspective than the professor, right? Then it's a real question of, oh, well, how is that going to affect their grade and therefore their future, right?
Yeah.
So it is a whole... It's a whole bit, but when we're talking about educating people, especially from a young age, you are right. Like it is important to be able to educate people. Unfortunately, nowadays, I think we see a lot of problems where people usually are turning to the internet and do get radicalized. Right, Zoomers are a thing, but I don't know. It's almost like a coin toss how they end up going, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It seems like it's just a case of like wherever you start out is sort of where you end up, and like in a more like entrenched or radicalized part of like wherever you start up, and it seems like where people end up politically has to do a whole lot with things outside of politics. Like where they get friends early on, or like where they build a community on, or like, even like what kind of game they play or something like that. A lot of people get their politics through like gaming in some way or another. It's I don't know. It seems like such a mess, and I really, it's really like it's really a symptom of a failure from the institutions of education, I think, in some way or another.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure like how to fix that, honestly, because like we do have in Denmark, we have like politics education,
Mhm.
In like middle school and in high school. Um, but it's like it's very much statistically based. Like it's like learning about how to do like social science, like polling and stuff like this, and like a little bit about like the different sort of ideologies, I guess. But it's mostly like I guess it's mostly like a lighter math course to some extent.
Mhm.
And I think that's fine, but that like remembering back, that didn't teach me much about politics. I think it was mostly about like, I guess it did teach about the political institutions in Denmark specifically. So like how to go out and vote. And I remember we did like a field excursion to like a voting booth, or like a voting place where we would like help out there like as a volunteer. That was pretty cool. But
Mhm.
it's like it doesn't really teach you much about like the different ideologies or how they interact or how they differ in like different ways and like yeah. But I guess how would you do that? That's another.
Yeah.
Hmm.
No, I definitely hear that. So there's sort of 2 points to make on this, right? First is that like there are I think that the US education system needs a complete reform. There are actually a lot of models that actually like over in Europe. I know that Finland is ranked as one of the best countries in the world for its, K through 12 education system or whatever they've got for like early education, right? I think that there's a lot to learn from that to implement over here because like the education system that we currently have was formulated back during times when the primary like when it was primarily an industrial economy, right? It is structured to be able to fundamentally teach students how to be able to operate in factory settings. There are specific times, there's a bell that rings that tells people when the shift starts and when it stops, and it's very like formulaic, right? So it ends up it was crafted at a time when we were much more focused on a different economy, and that's just not where we're at. So it does need a drastic from the ground up reform, right? The other element, like how we teach about politics specifically, I'm not sure if there's a great place in the schools for that. I think that's a battle that's more fought on social media and in society and in culture, right? I see that as being a battle that's being fought largely here and sort of in the battle of I've been thinking about politics a lot more in like this specific way in this specific way recently, right? I usually think about politics as the battle of trying to determine what is reasonable by societal standards, right? And I see
Hmm.
a lot of what we are doing here by trying to shift what the definition of reasonableness is, right? It's funny because like and the reason I use this term reasonableness, it is like a legal term of art, and it's one of the most important in the American legal system because like if I could give anyone, and mind you, I'm not a lawyer, this is an educational disclaimer, if I could, when I pass the bar, give anyone any one piece of legal advice, any single one, it is to act reasonably in any circumstance, right? Because a lot of laws in America focus on this idea of reasonability, what it means to be reasonable. What does it mean to be reasonable? Well, what does a jury of 12 people think is reasonable? What does a judge think is reasonable? It usually is reflective of societal standards. And so the battle
Yeah.
for politics for us on here is to try and shift what the definition of reasonableness is. And yeah, so I see if we want like practicable solutions based on that, we need more people saying these sorts of things, like more leftist or progressive YouTubers. We need more people spreading the message, and we need people who are watching, who are willing to also then take the things that they hear and convince the people that they know of those same ideas, right? I recently, because I don't know, I watched John Oliver, and that's one of my guilty pleasures, and I'm ashamed to admit it. But there was one recently where they talked about pyramid schemes, right? And there's this idea that like if you were to share your pyramid idea with like 7 or 12 people, then like after like 7 cycles of this, you would have eclipsed the entirety of the world. It's that same sort of idea, right? For every person, like I understand it seems like a very small thing, but for every person that you engage with, like a viewer engages with in their individual lives, that has the potential for that person then to go on and influence even more people, right? And so like it does.
So what you're saying is we should try and have 17 viewers and then just talk to them all the time, and it's just like, and they'll talk to 17, and then we'll have the world.
Exactly. That's totally that's totally it, right? Like you can be a 17 stream, you can be a 17 viewer, Andy. Yeah, totally, and you'll change the world. But it is like that sort of an idea, right? Obviously, that requires a lot of viewers, but I think that is something that does need to change, right? Because one criticism that I do have of online politics. And this is I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how much of this I can say, right? So
say it.
Well, I know a lot of larger, I guess what you would call like bread tubers, right? I'm close friends with some, right? And it's funny because like I will talk about them sometimes with like other people, like people at my office, or like I'm also the student, one of the co-chairs, so like one of the presidents of the student LGBT organization at my law school, and I'll mention them there. And most people at like wherever I mention them to, even my family, right, no one knows who these people are, right? And these are people which almost like completely eclipse our understanding of especially if you are very like especially if you are like very tied into or like very into like certain parts of like left tube or bread tube, like there are people who like everyone knows the name of, right? And it just kind of makes me realize that for as popular as we think that they are and for as much work that we think that they do, at the end of the day, the average person in the United States is probably not aware of what happens on here. And that's because like a lot of the people who view the content on here tend to not take it beyond that, right? Like they tend to look at what happens on here in a strictly viewership capacity, and they usually will leave it at the door, right? And the change, like the activism, is when people take it beyond there. That's when things start happening, when people start joining organizations like I'm trying to think of some, right? I know that like a standard one is like, I don't know, like Social Democrats for America. If you're a social democrat, if you're not, then don't join it or whatever. But like, other progressive organizations, you can join like National Democrats, you can join Workers United, you can join, like there's a ton of very progressive, especially like very worker-based or whatever you want to focus on groups that do a lot of really good advocacy work. And that's sort of the next step, is like getting viewers to mobilize in, affecting that sort of change. And then you can, to bring it back into what we were talking about initially, then you're able to get in, then you're able to elect in officials who are more progressive and representative of those views. And then those people are able to get past the policies that you want to pass, including policies on police reform. And that's how we got there. Yeah. I'm sorry. Like, I think about this. I mean, like, this is what I'm thinking about all the time, right? And I'll get off my high. I'm sorry, I talk a lot, but
No. It's fine. It's fine. It's honestly I like, one of the ways that I learn the best is just talking to people and getting sort of their perspectives, and then I tend to like write down a lot of stuff, and I can sort of research it a bit later as well.
Yeah.
But I think it's, at least for me, it's like super fruitful to just like hear people talk about these issues, even if some of the things I've heard before, it's sort of put in a new way.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I understand, like, I don't know, it's hard because like I'm not saying, like, especially on like the mobilization, I'm not saying anything new, and I know I'm not saying anything new, right? And there's a lot of people who are watching right now who probably will not fundamentally change how they interact with people, despite having watched this conversation. I don't know what it takes to actually get those people to mobilize. This is the game that I'm always thinking. Like, this is sort of where my mind is at right now. Like, how do you get people who are more progressive leaning or believe in these things to actually mobilize and take direct action, right? Direct action being, and this is a whole nother discussion, right? Like, if you are focusing on state politics, like looking up when certain bills are being discussed in Congress, showing up to hearings, because mind you, like in Maryland, when a bill is being discussed in in the state Congress, you can just go and appear before the committee that's deciding that bill or like presenting that bill, and you can just like present your case to them. You can't do that at the federal level. That's like a lot more exclusive. But at the state level, yeah, you can just go fucking testify. I didn't even know that was possible until I learned about it from my conversation the other day. You can just, like, anyone can go and just talk to the people. That's actually
pretty cool.
Yeah, like anyone can go and just like talk to the people writing the bill, but no one does it. And I learned about this from having a conversation with the attorney the other day, and I looked at her and I was like, why does no one do this? And she was just like, because most people don't know, right? Or most people don't tell them to. And it's just crazy to me, because like that is one of the single most effective ways to be able to get these sorts of changes passed, but people just don't take advantage of them. And it's frustrating because it's like, how do you get them to do it? This is
yeah. I mean, I imagine even like like through like any organization, just mobilizing like 100 people to go there, and like each person just testifies. I don't know. It seems like you could basically like filibuster the entire thing and just like
you really
make
could
them talk about
no,
your
it's
issue.
entirely true. And the thing that's most frustrating about this is that on Twitter, there are people who take advantage of this. But like 9 times out of 10, it's usually like fucking batshit crazy boomers who just like say the craziest fucking shit that you would ever believe. I saw a video earlier today where where there were like 3 people who appeared before. I think it was like a committee in Florida. I think it was like a more localized. So it would have been like a county committee, right? And effectively, they were protesting the committee having put forward a new regulation on having to wear masks for COVID. And like some of these people were saying that like by putting these laws in place that the committee was like in cohort with the devil or with Satan. And and you just look at these people and it's like these people are so insane. But you forget that that's because like anyone can go to these sorts of things and anyone can be heard, right? So there's literally no bar on being able to do that. And that's a double-edged sword, right? Yes, crazy people can go do that, but also by that same token, people can go who actually like believe the right sorts of things and want to promote the right ideas. And damn it,
for sure. And the issue is that it seems like a lot of people they really enjoy like talking about these things or talking about the issues, but they have a hard time mobilizing and like collectivizing and sort of going out and like doing these things in a group. And that's where I think like most of the issues come from. It's people not going out into the world and like doing more than just the basics, I guess. And some people don't even do the basics. Like I would consider voting to be like the bare minimum of like what you can do, right? But it's like there's so much more you can do outside of voting. And a lot of those things is trying to structure the things that you can vote on. So the first level is like going out and voting on whatever like other people put forward. But then you can try and influence, like the second step would be trying to influence the people putting policies forward into putting like more favorable policies forward. And then the third step would be like mobilizing to actually get your own people in to be the ones like writing these policies instead, like electing your own candidates.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know. It's so hard when like most people don't even do step 1 in local elections. Like only 20% of people. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I say all of that, right? And I vented my frustrations. I am a little more hopeful because I mean, like if we want to look at 2016 to 2020, Bernie, for example, as a candidate got vastly more support this time around than in 2016, right? Like he almost got the nomination, right? Which I think is symptomatic of a lot of people, especially a lot of younger people, beginning to get politically active, right? Like I do think that it is happening, at least to some extent, you know? It'll be very interesting to see what happens when 2024 rolls around. I mean, like, right now I'm of the opinion, I don't know, I'm just calling it when it happens, that like AOC will someday be, I'm not sure if it'll be next time around, but will someday be the Democratic nominee and probably will have a very good chance at getting in there. Now, will she face other problems like being a woman of color and also being progressive? Probably. But I definitely see, I mean, like people are already talking about her sort of being like this successor of Bernie, right? And even though Bernie did not get the nomination, I think that the people who got him to this point are still going to be around, and there's going to be even more of them the next time. Especially because now, like, I mean, let's be real. It's either going to be Biden or Trump. Either way, the people who wanted Bernie in there, like progressives, like Democrats, Democratic Socialists, like whoever, like socialists, like whoever you want to talk about, everyone is pissed, right? Everyone's going to be pissed with the outcome. There's no positive outcome. There's just like choosing the lesser of two evils. So like that excitement, that drive is not going to disappear over the next 4 years, right? That's only going to get stronger. In fact, I think it'll be very interesting to see a Biden presidency and how like people who are more progressive react to it, because like for the past 4 years, we've had to deal with Trump. And we've had to get acclimated to Trump. And I think at a certain point, people have just started to get like desensitized to it and like all the bullshit that he does. Like, I remember the other day, I heard that he approached the Supreme Court and was like, hey, can you try and take away the rights of LGBT people to be able to adopt? And I was just like, oh, yeah, that's normal. That's a normal thing in the day of Trump.
That's like normal discourse, yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah, it's super interesting. And like, there's so many different concepts in politics. I think... I honestly think, like, when I look at sort of the the Overton window in the United States, I think you're very on point when you say that, like, Bernie had more support this time around than like he's probably ever gonna get, because I don't think he's gonna run again. Like people who keep referring to like Bernie's like 2016 run, I followed that pretty closely. Like Bernie, I mean, I rooted for him, but he had no chance of winning like 2016.
Right.
And like in 2020, he was like a front runner for like a good few weeks before Super Tuesday. So it was I mean, I agree that the energy is definitely there. I worry that some of that might be gone once Bernie isn't the candidate anymore, because a lot of like what U.S. politics is about, at least like on a federal level, is name recognition, because there's just so many people who don't know like anyone.
Yeah,
and Bernie has a lot of name recognition by now, right? So I guess hopefully if Bernie is around, he can use some of that to sort of endorse, I guess, new candidates, which he's also doing right now on like a local level, or like on a Senate, I want to say Senate and House level. He endorsed like 4 or 5 candidates recently. I think that's super good. I think endorsements are one of those things where you can sort of transfer your own recognition over to like other people. In terms of where I see the Democratic Party going, I guess I think I'm a bit more positive on like a Biden presidency. Honestly, I think the way that a Biden presidency would go is that I think it could actually strengthen the progressive sort of aisle of the Democratic Party.
Interesting.
Because a lot of people think that people will go back to sleep if Biden wins, but I think if you are like a progressive person in the United States, I think you can very easily be critical of like a lot of like what Biden is proposing, and that doesn't stop if he's the president. It only gets like you have way more chances to be critical of him. Just in the same way that people are critical of Trump now, right? Like Trump has way more power, so you can spend more time criticizing him. If Biden has that power, you can spend all of your time criticizing Biden and sort of pushing it even further. And I think generally the way that I see Biden is that he's sort of a representative of the majority demographic of the Democratic Party. Like I don't think Biden is ever going to be the person who's going to try and pass something that doesn't have like majority approval in like the Democratic Party. And to change that is only to change, I guess, the Overton window or the minds of the average Democratic voter. And I don't think that is as hard as people make it out to be, honestly. I think it starts on the ground level and it sort of moves up.
Yeah. No, and I mean, like, I do agree with that. I don't think that, like, I tend to agree with just about all that, right? I don't think that people will get pacified. It will be very interesting because, I mean, like, yes, he is a Democrat. He's running on Democratic ticket. But it's very hard when you have a world which has a lot of problems which we need to face, right? I mean, hell, like, we can talk about climate change for an hour if we really wanted to.
Sure, yeah.
But we have someone who is fundamentally running on the platform of, I will not change anything. And he's basically just hoping to sort of win by default of the fact that he's running against someone who's, like, actually sort of, like, you know, say what you want, destroying the world, and out and about fascists, making the problems with police brutality worse, making the problems with COVID worse. I mean, like, pick your poison. Someone who's literally been impeached. I think people forget about that. Literally was impeached in the House, and somehow people are still having this conversation about whether or not he is fit to be president. But and I'm shitting on Trump a lot, but it.
I mean, we can also talk about Trump for like a few hours.
We could. It's so much. Like, God, it'll be It'll be really interesting to see how historians like handle Trump as a person, because I know that he is like one of the most impactful political figures in recent history. Like he has changed the game fundamentally. Like yeah, before Trump, it was all establishment politicians for the longest time, and I think that we're starting to get out of there. And I think that's sort of a big reason why if Biden wins, I think it'll be really hard to put up another sort of like establishment Democrat after the fact, right? Because I think we are getting to a point where large parts of our society are starting to get more radicalized. Whether it's far right or far left is another question. But
yeah, it seems like anti-establishment is sort of the way that the average American person is sort of going, like both from the left and from the right. I mean,
we're just turning into dreg. We're turning into JREG, the nation.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And to some to some extent, I understand it. I mean, I'm not. It's sort of for me, it's like a degree of populism, right? I think populism definitely has its place, but it also has the potential to be very toxic in some aspects, or at least the way that populism has been used. And I think, like the issue with Trump is that he is basically just like a rhetoric machine, right? He just shouts out fucking rhetoric and it works, and it doesn't it's not even only in the United States that it works, but it's like I remember as soon as Trump got elected, like the politicians even here in Denmark, they just started changing their rhetoric to like more Trumpian rhetoric, to the point where like most of the right-wing parties in Denmark, like when they go to debates, and like we recently had like election in 2018, like most of the people just use like some variant of like Trump rhetoric and like focus on the same things that Trump focuses on. It seems like it's very much like a global movement of people switching to like more populist ways of addressing issues, like being like you need some kind of enemy in place, and then you need to, I guess, structure all of your rhetoric to be against that enemy. I don't know.
Well, if I might contribute to that thought, I mean, I see a lot of it as like the rise of reactionary thinking. And I understand that people throw around reactionary a lot as a term, so let's define it, right?
Yeah.
Reactionary being the way of thinking where you want to return to a previous form, like not necessarily something that accurately existed in the past, but a call or an ideology based on trying to return to some previously prosperous time, right? Or some previous like the good times, or the times when everything was fine and good and dandy in the world. Because now everything is shit, and the people who are trying to change it are just making it worse, and they're the enemy, and we need to demonize them as much as possible, because what we had before was great, and these people want to make things worse, right? And it's this, and it's this form of thinking which is just kind of invaded.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I think a lot of reactionary thought can be sort of boiled down to sort of wanting to preserve what is, or going back to something that just was. And I think that's something that I like fundamentally have like an opposition to, right? Because I like, more than anything, I probably like, I believe in progress. I believe that the best days are yet to come. I believe that in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years, like human society will evolve to such a large extent that we won't even recognize sort of the ideologies of today. And that is why that's why I'm also sometimes hesitant to put a label on myself, because I do fundamentally believe that like in 50 years, we won't be talking about like ideologies in the same way that we talk about today, because things are happening at such a fast rate right now that only looking at the next step is going to bring any real change, I think. Because I think it's impossible to predict like how the world is going to look 5 steps down from where we are.
Yeah, no, and I do agree with that, right? So I'll make the caveat, and I've talked about this before, right? Because I think about this a lot. At this point in time, if people want to place a label on me as far as like what I hold as political values, the best label is probably going to be social democrat. that is based purely on the policies that I want to put forward right now. Going back to our conversation earlier, I'm a political pragmatist. I want to make sure that I am advancing policies which I know have the best chance of passing and which will materially benefit the people, like people's lives and society on the whole, right? I think that, like, I agree that 50 years down the line, we are going to be facing a lot of different issues as a society and as a world, which are going to require different solutions. And given whatever those problems are and where society is at, then the label for me personally probably will change to something like a socialist or a communist, depending on what the world needs at that point, right?
Yeah. I think so. The whole discussion with labels is it's a bit silly because everybody applies them in different ways. Like the way that I like to view labels is that I think labels should try and be descriptive, in a sense where you can sort of gauge the general idea that somebody wants to take their politics, from their label. That's sort of the value that I see, and the way that I tend to, I guess, characterize people or like even characterize myself is that I like to put the label at like the most extreme end of like what that person believes, right? So like, or like the furthest form of their politics. Like if you were supreme leader of the world, how would the world look? That's how I tend to like view labels. Because I think if we put people's labels to just like what do they think the next step in the world is going to be, then I think most people would probably be like a social democrat or like a liberal or something like that, right? Like 99% of people.
Yeah,
and I don't think that's as descriptive or depictive of like what people believe. So yeah, but that's like my own preference of like how I like to talk about these labels. At the end of the day, I don't think they're like very useful, honestly, because like most people have different views anyway on like a bunch of stuff, especially like when you talk about policy. Like especially when you get down into the dirt and talk about specific policies, like fucking people, like there is no point in talking to somebody who's like an anarchist or like a Marxist-Leninist or even like, I don't know, a libertarian or whatever, when you're talking about policies, because none of these policies will necessarily bring upon like the world that they would like to see. Like most generally, like policies only apply to the world that is right now. So it's like it doesn't have like a meaningful distinction there, I think.
Yeah, no, and I definitely see that. It is very hard because on one hand, I do see benefit to the idea of, I don't know what you want to call it, something to the effect of leftist unity. I would like to be able to perceive of a world where, because I mean, like, if we want to talk about the distinctions broadly between like the right and the left, like the right, there's tons of there's tons of difference of opinions in there, right? Like you have people who are like more moderate conservatives, and then you have like out and about fascists, right? And they're all sort of under the same umbrella of right. But usually they're able to put aside their differences to actually like advance the goals that they want. And I don't know if this is symptomatic of just the online left or like the left broader, like even IRL or whatever you want to call it, not online. But there is a lot of infighting, and not just infighting, right? Like I think that there can be a healthy amount of argumentation that keeps us humble, right? And that makes sure that we're honest. But like infighting to the point where it's almost debilitating, right? To the point where it's almost impossible to be able to advance the same goals with one another. Like when we get into conversations about whether or not it's even a viable option to vote, like the basic minimum threshold for political engagement in our society, and people are like arguing about whether or not we should be doing that much, we're not in a great spot, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's honestly, I don't know. The more that I could, because I when I started streaming, or like when I started talking politics online, I thought that we were gonna be discussing like very fundamental baseline values and ideas, and that's like where I've done like most of my sort of groundwork and thinking and sort of writing things down. But it seems like that is so many steps removed from what the world really needs right now, and like what most people need to hear, because like most people don't even engage in like the very basics of politics. Like it's fuck. It's so hard to talk about like base values and how you want to structure society and all these things. Well, like most people don't even go out and vote. It's like if they don't care that much, then it's gonna be terribly hard to like get them to care about like fucking the fundamentals of like what an anarchist society is gonna look like. I don't know.
Right. No, and I mean, I get that. I don't want to pick on I don't want to pick on a particular person, but I mean, there definitely was a lot of discussion in the panel that we had about like voting versus direct action. And essentially like structuring them as like uh two mutually exclusive ideas. Like if you were to do one as if it implies you cannot or should not do the other, right? And the thing about it, and this is sort of why I had the follow-up conversation with the attorney that I did about like what direct action can be taken, right? A lot of it directly informs the ability for you to vote, right? Because like direct action, like for example, if direct action involves going to your state Congress and testifying about a bill in Congress, or testifying about a bill that's being proposed to Congress, right? That is probably going to be something which is heavily informed, or it can be directly affected by who you vote to put in those positions, right? Like, if you go out and vote and you elect in a very progressive Democrat, and then you go and testify in front of that progressive Democrat, guess what? You have just increased the chances of actually getting that bill passed, like, astronomically, right?
For sure.
And so, but like, if that's what...
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can do direct action, and like depending like who you talk to, like there's different avenues even. Um, so I think like most of the time, I think when people talk about direct action, they don't necessarily talk about like electoral direct action, like going
Yeah.
out in front of testifying and stuff.
Well, what do they
At least
usually
when I
talk about then? I mean, I guess this
yeah,
is where
I
I'm
mean,
sort of hung up on it. Is that like I never
yeah,
understand what it seems like there's this nebulous idea of
yeah,
what direct action is, but there's
yeah,
not
yeah,
really a good
yeah.
definition of what it is.
Yeah, I 100% get that. And that is like my big issue as well, is that people will fucking scream direct action and they'll never say, okay, but what do we do? Like, what is direct action? Um, and like, yeah, fuck. Like, there's so many surface level ideas, but never like any real solution.
Hmm.
So what I think like is a good example of like direct action is like going on economic strikes
Hmm.
or like mobilizing workers to do like one thing or another, or like even sabotage can be seen as direct action as well. Like
Interesting.
sabotaging like different institutions, like taking over the police precincts. That has happened in like the recent protests and
Oh,
riots.
really? I was not aware
Um,
of that.
yeah,
Like
that
protesters taking over the precinct.
yeah, or like burning down the precincts.
Mm.
Yeah, I would see that as like direct action as well, like direct action against the institutions that are in place.
Considering my
Something
work,
like that.
yeah, considering my work, I will not comment on that. But it is
That's right.
it's certainly an interesting thought.
Yeah, sure, yeah. So it's like that's sort of the ways that I see direct action, like protesting. In itself is like a direct action as well, like going out and sort of trying to move the needle and forcing people to think about issues that directly affect you
Hmm.
through like I, I guess I would say even through like non-democratic means, right? Like being a minority in a place and then coming together and like making people care about you as a minority. I think that's like that's maybe a good way to sort of frame like what direct action generally is about. And generally, like when people talk about, they talk about like um, mobilizing a lot of people together to like advocate for one thing. But at the end of the day, um, like no matter how you sort of turn and twist it, direct action is gonna have to be responded to by politicians.
Hmm.
And if you have politicians in place who are more favorable to your cause, you're gonna get more favorable outcomes. I mean, it's that simple, really. So, I mean, it comes down to electing people who are sympathetic to your causes at the end of the day.
Hmm.
Um,
No,
so yeah,
and
I mean, I think they're very very closely related.
yeah, no, and I do agree. I agree with essentially all of that. It's hard. Oh no, and this is why I do want, and mind you, like I'm not trying to morally impugn people who make these sorts of arguments. I don't try to. Um, I mean, like fundamentally, like these are people, like the people who make these arguments, even if they don't have, I don't want to say not as informed of an opinion, but an opinion which doesn't think through these sorts of implications, right? They are fundamentally trying to, I guess, move the glacier in the same direction, to use another streamer's terminology, right? Um, so it's hard because I do want to fundamentally like understand that perspective, and maybe change some minds. But it also seems like
Sure.
a lot of people who come from these sorts of perspectives are sort of like digging in their heels, right? It's almost as if their belief is an identity in and of itself, and to deviate from those beliefs is to deviate from your identity.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's an interesting question of like where do you start and like how do you do your advocacy?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think like because I do fundamentally believe in direct action and sort of the ways that direct action can sort of move the needle or like move the Overton window or however you want to frame it, and sort of get things passed. I definitely believe in that, and I think historically a lot of the good has come from like protesting and sort of people just taking the streets.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it seems like getting to that point where people are willing to do that is so incredibly hard when like most people don't even want to do like step one, right? And you're talking about like when we're talking direct action, I feel like we're talking about step four, right?
Mm-hmm.
We got like step one, which is just going out to vote. Step two is affecting the people who put the policies forward to make the policies better for you. Step three is electing your own candidates and sort of from the ground up building a movement. And then step four would be like taking the streets and like spending all of your time doing politics and advocacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like if most people aren't even on step one, then why the fuck are we talking about step four?
Yeah.
It's I don't know.
No, no, and
Yeah.
I do agree, and I do agree. Um, we don't have to, like, now we're starting to circle back to things that we talked about earlier. I think a lot of it certainly has to do with when we're talking about, on online political discourse. There's something that, I don't know, maybe people don't see this as like, maybe there's something in people's brains that don't make them like click and realize like, oh shit's real. And I don't want to like deviate, like, some people might, take that comment in bad faith and be like, of course, Riley, I understand that these are very real things. Don't morally impugn me. And I'm not. Um, what I'm just saying is that like I feel like for a lot of people, and like I'm guilty of this too, right? Like this was me for a while. I think it's very easy to, when you are kind of submerged in an online space where everything is very impersonal, where you're just some person watching content and you're not really interacting with a lot of other people, especially in person. It can be really easy to become, at least to some extent, apathetic, about like political engagement, right? Like, sure, you agree with something in a logical sense, but it can be very hard to find like that inner drive to go out and do things, especially in like a very like post-capitalist society where most people don't even have the time or the resources or the energy to, right? So that
Yeah.
probably has like some degree of effect. But I think for me, and this is like taking this conversation out beyond this, right? This is what I see a lot of my work on here, for as limited as it is, right? Because I do have other work that I try to focus on, and that it takes up more of my time. But I see that as a lot of what is important for us to do here is to actually get people to take what they learn from here and go out and do something with it.
Yeah, for sure. And um I think at the end of the day, that's like one of the most valuable things that we can do on
Mm-hmm.
like a platform like this. However big or small the size, I think affecting people and giving them tools to take into their life and like talk to the people in their life and talk to their relatives, talk to their friends about these issues, I think that's like one of the most important things we can do, and give them good arguments, give them good ways of talking about it.
Yes.
I think that's
Yeah, no, I agree. So I feel like we've sort of rounded back to this point. Is there anything else that we want to talk about? Any other policies or anything else you want to touch on? I see that we're about an hour and a half in.
Yeah, like, and you said you wanted to go for an hour, so I'm sorry for keeping you so long. It's
hey, you're fine. This has been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like honestly we could talk for hours about like all kinds of things, and I wanted to talk to you sort of like about political, I guess, values and value systems, and sort of how you build your, I guess, political ideology from the ground up. But that's probably for another time, I think.
Yeah. Hey, we can schedule. Like, listen, we can. I'm totally cool. We can talk again. I really enjoyed this, and yeah, I would. Like I do put a lot of thought into, you know, where I identify politically or the things that I advance, my value systems. But yeah, that definitely is like an entirely different conversation.
Sure.
All right.
Well, yeah. So I guess do you want to just shout yourself out to my viewers?
Yeah. Hey everyone. Thanks for listening to me and him drone on for a while. My name is Riley Grace Rochong. I have a small YouTube channel just named after me, or at Riley Grace 1996. You can also find me on Twitter with the same handle, Instagram, all that. And yeah, I don't know. Hope to see you there.
Yeah, that was very cool talking to you. Thank you very much for entertaining me for an hour and a half. And yeah, hope to talk to you again very soon.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, hey, thanks, man. Talk to you later.
Yeah, catch you later.
Bye.